Welcome to Shifting Ground, the podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Join us every other week as our editors connect the pages of Orbis with the issues of the day.
I'm Nick Vosdev, a professor at the Naval War College and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
And I'm Larry Rubin, an associate professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology.
Together, we serve as editors of Orbis, the Journal of World Affairs.
Each episode will speak with scholars, policymakers, and practitioners about the forces reshaping global politics, international security, and world affairs.
You can find this and future episodes of Shifting Ground on our website, orbisjournal.org, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major streaming services. Please note that the views expressed by the hosts and participants in this episode are their own. This is Shifting Ground.
Today we're joined by Phil Wasilewski, Director of the Center of the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare at the Foreign Policy Research. And Phil served for more than 3 decades in the CIA's Directorate of Operations, including service on the National Security Council staff and as a member of the first CIA team into Afghanistan after 9/11. He also is a retired U.S. Marine Corps Reserve officer and a leading analyst of intelligence, irregular warfare, Russia, and strategic competition. Phil, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Phil, I want to kind of start off by, we often do this with our guests, of just kind of hearing about a little bit about your career. It's quite interesting and exciting. And I guess more specifically, what experiences in your career shaped how you think about strategy and conflict today?
Well, regarding my career, my years of government service, it started after college. I graduated from Penn. I went to school on a Naval ROTC scholarship. So I spent 7 years on active duty with the Marines as an infantry and reconnaissance officer, including a fair amount of time overseas. And I stayed in the Marine Corps Reserve for another 23 years, including mobilizations twice after 9/11 for combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then after, like I said, about 7 years, I was a young captain in the Marine Corps. I was hired into the agency as a paramilitary officer. And there I spent 31 years in the Directorate of Operations, collecting human intelligence and supporting paramilitary covert action programs, usually in austere environments or war zones. And then towards the end of my career, I spent a year as the Directorate of Operations Group Chief in the agency's Office of Congressional Affairs, and saw that part of the agency. And then after that assignment, I spent almost 3 years on the National Security Council staff as a director for intelligence and covert action programs. When I returned to the agency, my final assignment was dealing with Russia. So I retired about 5 years ago. And since then, as Nick knows, I'm a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'm also on the faculty of the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service with Texas A&M University. They have a D.C. campus where I teach at. And mainly in retirement, here at our house, I'm the doorman for the dog, the chauffeur for the kids, and the gardener, repairman, and manual labor for the wife. So that's sort of my career.
Yeah, even despite all of those demanding assignments that you have now, you're still producing a lot of cutting edge work. You're looking at this notion of non-traditional warfare, that if people have in their minds that warfare in the past, large massed armies, massed battles, looking at how technology is changing, how nations use the military instrument of power is changing. Is there anything where you would look back in your career in government or outside of government now, as you look back over these decades, where you might say that there was a moment where it fundamentally changed your view or your perspective on the use of the military instrument, the relationship of military power to intelligence, or how the military instrument of power and the intelligence instrument of statecraft intersect with politics, with political objectives set by civilian decision makers?
There was no real aha movement, except maybe very much at the beginning when I was a young Marine. I'll cover that. But it's more evolution than revolution in my, development understanding. And for our audience and listening, when you talk about non-traditional warfare, that is a term we came up with the previous president of FPRI. She wanted me to look at intelligence and irregular warfare. And when I sat down to try and write about this, I was stumped. And then I realized, because that was my career in the agency, the two items. And then I realized, well, we were missing a very important part. So what we call non-traditional warfare at FPRI is a combination of irregular warfare and political warfare, as defined by George Kennan. And what has influenced my approach and my outlook and educated me really was a combination of both formal education and real world experiences that shaped my thinking. I came into the agency, the Soviet Union still existed. It was on its last legs, but it was still there. It was the end of the Cold War. And I saw those operations in action. And then right after the fall of the Soviet Union, I was able to travel and live extensively in the former Soviet spaces, the countries that had merged, and the Warsaw Pact countries that were finally freed. And this was an excellent on the ground education and, shall we say, conflict studies, considering the areas I lived and worked in. After several years of this, almost a decade, I had a great opportunity to go back to school and to get a master's in Russian studies at Harvard University in the late 1990s. And this exposed me to an even wider range of views and experiences. The program I was in, it was called RICA, Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, required its students to study not only the history and politics of the region, but also its economics, its literature, and languages beyond Russian. And I was also able to take a number of classes at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Great opportunity. So there again was an example of formal education. And then I went back into the field, and for the next 20 years of my career, I used this knowledge in various assignments in the former Soviet region, but also dealing with circumstances brought on by the war on terror after 9/11. And those experiences in the field, including multiple war zones in my time working with Congress and at the National Security Council, are the key elements that shaped how I think about international relations and U.S. foreign policy in general. Now, the aha moment for me, all of that was just an accumulation of knowledge, both formal teaching at Penn and Harvard, and also in the field in various different conflicts in the regions. The aha moment for me was as a second lieutenant at the basic school in the Marine Corps Association bookstore, small little room they had there. I came upon a book by a gentleman called Bernard Fall, and it was called Street Without Joy. And I began reading that. And from that time on, I was interested in irregular warfare and the type of warfare that's predominated most of our conflicts since World War II. So that was the aha movement that kind of pointed me in this direction. And as I've described, it was a combination of formal education and also real world experiences that have shaped how I view strategy and conflict today.
It's absolutely fascinating, and also kind of your reflection to look back what it must have been like to travel in those states in the former Soviet Union. That toward even the beginning of your career, it was toward the end of the Soviet Union itself. You had been studying, and then you were able to the floodgates were open and to kind of go investigate. My question relates to some extent, thinking back a little bit more about your career in terms of how. Thinking on the intelligence side of how it's changed and how intelligence is gathered, because you must have a lot of thoughts in that way, the explosion of open source intelligence today, and then how the type of intelligence that you worked on, much more so in the field 30 plus years ago. What are some of your broader thoughts on this, or what are some of the insights that you've gained more recently?
Well, intelligence collection, like war, the face of war may change. The basic essence of war never does. And the same for intelligence collection. For example, the question of open source information, of which is expanded exponentially. in the past several decades. I will take the position that it hasn't changed a thing about the intelligence business, neither from the viewpoint of the analyst or from the collector. The job of the intelligence analyst remains the same, whether the raw intelligence that collector uses comes from clandestine sources or open sources. An intelligence analyst still must weave separate threads of that raw intelligence, wherever it comes from, into a coherent story so policymakers can make a decision. That's the essence of their job. Now, for collectors, the explosion of open source intelligence sources does not take away from our core mission, and that is to collect information needed by policymakers that cannot be obtained by open means. Nations will always have secrets. Foreign leaders will not always be clear or honest about their intentions. Non-state actors such as terrorists, drug dealers, gun runners, etc., will always try to hide their nefarious goals and plans. The specifics of hidden plans, capabilities, and intentions are what clandestine collectors must discover and why we will always be necessary.
Building on that, the collection side, I think we're always going to need. And as you just laid that out, I think very clearly that we don't live in an age of complete transparency where everything is knowable and available. We're also always going to need interpretation. We're never going to have a complete picture. We'll have contradictory pictures. Disinformation can be released. Misinformation can circulate. What's your sense about the evolution of the analytic side of intelligence work? And something that I'm seeing and this is certainly ballooned since the start of a full-scale resumption of full-scale operations by the Russians against Ukraine in 2022, is that people throw out a lot of information, but you still need to analyze it. You need to interpret what you're seeing. How are you seeing that evolve in an age where people say, well, it doesn't matter, the AI large language model can analyze for us, or everything is knowable? Are you seeing any sense that we're regaining an appreciation for the analyst, and particularly for the analyst as you were describing your own career path, deep learning, exposure to languages and literature and history? Where does the analytic piece fit in to all of this?
Well, I hesitate in a way, Nick, to speak about the analytical challenges. Being an operator, and I'm sure that the analysts have their own version. I'll just posit from my own experiences, though, at the NSC, that when we're finished with putting all of the raw intelligence through artificial intelligence, I hope there's some real intelligence, human intelligence, to look at it and say, what does this mean? Because the thing that I learned specifically on the National Security Council staff is that the process of analyzing intelligence, like I said, of weaving all those disparate threads in, and by the way, you're never going to have all of the information you need. It will often be ambiguous. And there will also be disinformation, misinformation, non-information in there to sort out, that only a human being can look at, and using their experiences, and that what in tactics you would call a fingertip feel for the battlefield, but their feel for the subjects and their expertise to weave that story. And then, and here's the most important part, here's the synopsis where intelligence sometimes falls short in, is take that, bring it to the policymaker, and explain why is it important and what it means. So then the policymaker to use as he or she sees fit. And then that cycle, because the policymaker is it's not just one way. Every single answer will raise two more questions when you bring it to a policymaker, as it should. And there will be a continuous cycle that then goes back to the collector, and we know the intelligence cycle. So this is something that can never be replaced by machines, by computers. The interpersonal relationships between the senior intelligence officials, the senior analytical service people dealing with the policymakers who need the information, even though it will never be complete and it will never be totally clear about what it may mean, and then what options they may have to deal with it.
And that actually then leads me into particular specific area where these things come together, and that has been looking at what has been happening in the context, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and perhaps what this says about that intersection, you say, of information has to be collected, it has to be analyzed, it has to be presented to decision makers, and decision makers then have to take that into account with what outcomes they would like to see, with what risks they're willing to take. And one of the things that I'm grappling with myself personally is things that I didn't get right, or calls about how this conflict would unfold that I'm now revising and going back and saying, well, was my information wrong? Was my analysis off? Would I have been right under different circumstances? And in particular, I think you had, from speaking with people who were in government, there was either a sense in 2022 that this would be a rapid Russian operation, and that was the first assumption that didn't pan out. And then the second is that Russia's ability to sustain this operation after several months of determined Ukrainian resistance would cause Russia to have to abandon it. And we're now entering our fourth year of this conflict. So, is there things from you're seeing, and particularly, you're out of government now, and just, as an expert and as an analyst and as someone with deep knowledge of the area, things that we should have paid more attention to? Did we miss the boat, for example, on Ukraine's resilience? Are we missing the boat about Russia's ability, and certainly Putin's ability, to sustain this conflict?
In other words, where did we go wrong?
Or did we go in an alternate universe? Could we have been right that our analysis was right, but we were caught by surprise by something, as you said? And this gets back to your question too, where as you said in the answer to the previous discussion, that machines may not be able to anticipate things like human resilience, where the machine might say it's not logical to continue this conflict, and yet there's a tenacity for human beings to continue under circumstances that the machine logic can't explain.
Well, to answer your question, first off, I thank you for the word you used a few moments ago, but I'm not an expert. And I say that because, in my mind, an expert is someone who has nothing left to learn. And I'm learning every day on this and so many other subjects. And I think that those we put our trust in, some so-called experts who proved to be very wrong because of a total misunderstanding of the subject and a lack of experience. There was a good study put out about a year and a half ago, I think, or maybe it's 2 years now, by Phillips Payson O'Brien and Dr. Elliot Cohen on this subject, a review that was done that I thought did a very good review of looking at the open source failures of the analytical community on this very question. And I'll come back to that. In my mind, because I wrote about this before the invasion, little communist self-criticism here. Here's what I think I got wrong, is the length of the war and the ability of both sides to endure what many would consider the unendurable when you look at this war. On the Ukrainian side, it was an unknown and it could not be known. But we've seen Ukrainians are enduring. And I was texting back and forth with my friends in Kyiv during the winter. They were enduring the horrible winter with no heat in their apartments. I know what that was like. I lived in the former Soviet Union in places where there was no heat in the winter, not from war, just from the breakdown of the infrastructure. And they endured. This last winter was Ukraine's Valley Forge, but they've come out of that resilience because, as one friend of mine, Ukrainian, says, we have no other choice. And they know that it was an existential moment for them. And that word existential is used a lot in our national security writings too frequently and inaccurately. But in this case, it met what happened in Ukraine, and what's happening meets the actual definition of the word. On the Russian side, I'm still struck, despite my years, of studying this nation and culture, by the willingness of Russian society and the soldiers that are products of that society to endure things that would cause most people to rebel in order to support a national identity based mainly on imperialism, autocracy, and orthodoxy. And if you're a student of Russia, you know where that comes from. That was the Russian idea espoused in the 19th century. Now, I knew this before, And I know that Russians are different from us culturally, and they're not Western, even though they are of Europe. They identify themselves in opposition to Western culture, although Western culture would not be complete if it did not include Russian contributions in literature, art, dance, music, architecture, science, etc. So these things I knew, and I'm not speaking for every single 140 million Russians today, but this is generally, I will take it as a reflection of their society, and that still surprised me. I remember early in the war, I would be watching these videos, and I would then harken back to my early days as a Marine second lieutenant in the infantry, and wonder how I would motivate my Marines to endure what the Russians were enduring. And then I have to remind myself that I and my Marines come from a different culture, one influenced by the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment. Now, if you've met a lot of Marines, you probably don't see those influences often. But we're from this society, this Western society, but the Russian soldiers are not. And they have different cultural influences, such as centuries of autocracy, communism, Stalinism, which creates a great fatalism in Russian society. As the soldiers of the Imperial Russian Army used to say, our souls belong to God, but our bodies belong to the Tsar. Well, so far, that ethos seems to be playing out in modern Russia. So those are the things that still surprise me, the length of this war and the ability to endure. I was not surprised by most of it, though, because if you really study the history of the Russian army, the Russian way of war, the history of these conflicts, and you have a basic understanding of tactical and operational procedures, you would have seen what would have been the difficulties of such an invasion in the winter with armored forces by an army that had not done something like this since the Battle of Berlin in 1945. As a matter of fact, now this is before I joined FPRI, so I wrote 3 articles for CSIS with Seth Jones. And I would go back to those articles and I say that the two of us, we predicted almost all of the things that were going to happen tactically, and also warnings about such things as start preparing legal documentation of the war crimes that were going to come. If you knew about the Russian way of war from Syria, from Chechnya, from Afghanistan, you knew what was coming. And unfortunately, this came true too.
On the one hand, we have this resilience and durability. On the other hand, Russian and Soviet history also points to elements where the regime and the structure is unable to bear the pressure and it collapses. And there's been a back and forth about what will be the signs, right? Would there be indicators? What would be the stressors on the regime that might cause it to buckle, to change course? There's been talk over the last 4 to 5 months, really, since the beginning of 2026, that Russia is entering into this period of severe stress, augmented by Ukraine's resilience, again, unpredicted by many, and not just simply resilience, but ability to continue to deliver counter blows, and in particular now to try to bring the reality of the war closer to, quote unquote, the average Russian, that it's not something that's happening further away. And so that this discussion about, well, does this going to lead to change? Do you have a checklist or a set of indicators that if you were to brief a policymaker to say, look for these things if you think that there could be a regime that is under severe stress or is about to buckle or collapse, or is it really episodic and it may just happen unexpectedly? What's your sense of how we should be approaching that?
Well, Nick, that's another wide-ranging question. So let me answer it kind of, I'll start off wide and then let me narrow down the focus to the more particular to get into that. As I've just described some of the ethos of the Russians on the front line. And I do believe that we are going to see change in the situation. However, I literally a couple of hours ago just got a signal message from someone who's on the front lines on the Ukrainian side. I asked him sort of like this question. His 1-sentence answer to me was, "Don't pop the champagne corks yet." Yet in that, I still believe that we may see changes, but I want to put that in context first of the Russia that we have today, which I've described. Now, one thing I've learned in my studies of Russia and Russians and the knowledge gained from numerous personal relations I've had with all types of Russian citizens, from intelligence officers and diplomats and soldiers to ordinary citizens, is that most would prefer to be subordinates with limited human rights and personal freedoms in a worldwide empire than average citizens in a mid-sized power with full amount of civil rights. That sense of pride in being feared or in being rulers over others on the Eurasian continent is a major part of that staying power of Russian society. We have to understand this. The Russians in general, again, I'm not speaking of all 140 million, but as we've seen, this is a war supported at least passively by most of society. And what will cause problems is not if the Russians, as we've seen, cause major war crimes or destruction or attack civilians, anything like that. That they will not go against their government on or protest against their government. They will protest losing. No Russian leader has lost territory or lost the war and in the long run been able to stay in power. Now, there's two options that we're looking at. One is, or I should say two, not options, but two scenarios. One is a defeat of the Russian army in Ukraine would then lead to change in Moscow. The other scenario is that economic pain amongst the Russian people would lead to this scenario as well. Of the two, I believe the former, defeat on the battlefield, is more likely to be a cause than the latter, for the very reason is that the Russians have a long tolerance for suffering. As I wrote in the recent article for FPRI, Russia After Putin, where I listed, the problems inherent, I think we need to be very careful of how we talk about events afterwards. If the Russian army was to implode on the battlefield, and think of all the things going on right now on the battlefield, particularly the operational level attacks against the logistical system and the command and control systems in the Russian rear in the southern part of occupied Ukraine and on the island of Crimea, or on the peninsula of Crimea, that could cause at a certain time the army to implode because of lack of gas, lack of ammunition, a lack of supplies, inadequate command and control, inability to bring reserves up. Should the Ukrainians be able to then in the summer or in the fall be able to make some sort of attacks, as they did in 2022 in the fall and as they did in 2024 into Kursk? The big question has always been, on the Russian side, how much can they support? On the Ukrainian side, it's how many reserves can they bring up to be able to affect the battlefield and the correlation of forces there. If something was to happen, it would probably, if there was to be a collapse, it would probably be quick. I'll tell you, fear spreads quickly on a battlefield. Disaster spreads quickly. Think of the World Trade Center towers imploding, the floors collapsing on each other. Think of that as a metaphorical vision of what could happen if the Russian army was to face such a defeat on the battlefield. This might bring us to leadership change. How, I won't particularly go into. Regime change is something else, because then you're not just changing Putin. You're changing the whole structure that supports Putin, and that is not changed. So what happened in 1991 was not really a revolution. We went from communism to this current system. There's a little bit of an interim under Yeltsin, which was a super presidential system. And then we went into Putinism, which is no different than what we had since the Romanovs took power, or even before that. The only real revolution we've had in the way Russia was governed was 1917. That changed the regime. That changed the Romanov regime. So I would say that we're more likely to see leadership change than we are to see regime change, which is why I wrote in Russia After Putin that Russia after Putin is going to be pretty much like Russia during Putin because of the national identity issue. whoever takes over from Putin, and I do not know who would want this job, because all the problems that Putin faces will remain that I've listed in that article. For the sake of time, I won't go into them now. But the person who replaces Putin is going to have to make some hard decisions. Rather, is he going to make peace with Ukraine? What settlement would he make? What terms can he make? Can he give up territory? Can he give up the things that Russia has gained and paid so high a cost for, and then not pay a domestic cost at home and be overthrown in a coup? I mean, compromise over Ukraine by Putin or whoever replaces Putin is more likely to lead to a coup than it's to lead to peace in some aspects. What I think we should be looking at is the important thing for Russia's future is not going to be who replaces Putin. It's who replaces Putin. Because who replaces Putin is going to have an unenviable job. He'll never be able to satisfy anyone. It's the person who replaces that person who's going to decide the direction. And barring revolutionary change in the system, a la 1917, I think we're going to have basically Russia, as this century unfolds, pretty much as the Russia we have now, because of that sense of national identity. The person who replaces Putin and the person who replaces that person will continue on the path trodden by Putin, imperial and anti-Western, unless forced to by a major challenge to Russia's existence, most likely by China, which I wrote about a few years ago in the article for FPRI, Will Russia Survive Till 2084? So that is my answer. Forgive me, for the long approach towards the finale there. But that's what I see, because, throughout its entire history, Russia's been ruled by autocracy, fear, and pride of imperial power. And we are going to need a major change in Russian national identity, as I talked about before at the beginning of this answer. An upheaval similar to 1917, not 1991, to change that.
Well, thanks so much. And it's really fascinating. And I think we can go on forever. But kind of in the interest of time, I want to shift gears back to another really fascinating thing about your career. And correct me if I'm wrong, you were among the first team to go into Afghanistan after 9/11. Just kind of looking back many, many years later, what is some of the most important lessons learned from Afghanistan, from this experience of the United States there, and how you kind of understand it, and what policymakers should think about today, as we've seen it kind of has certainly fallen off the radar. And any new conflict takes over. Russia-Ukraine one has been dwarfed by Iran, and Afghanistan's all but forgotten, but not for, of course, the people who served there, and also others who had loved ones died there.
Afghanistan was one, and it's a part of me, always will be there. So is Iraq. So have been previous wars I was in, and then what has been happening since. Just like I mentioned in my career, what developed my thinking, my outlook on strategy and international relations has been more evolution. It's been a combination of things. To answer your question, I would have to say it's a combination of all of those wars, all of those conflicts. Where I see the biggest disconnect, say, between how policymakers think about the conflict and how it actually unfolds, a couple of things. The first mistake, I think, is, and this is not unique to Americans, but it's the short war fallacy. Most strategic disasters have at their root this idea that war can be short and that an enemy will quickly surrender because our strength is so overwhelming. Okay, we saw this not just in Afghanistan, but many other places before Afghanistan and since. But that follows here another fallacy, and I think that we have in our modern society today, and that is that war is not violent or ugly because it's usually seen from afar. War is a video game that can be waged by remote control, that successful bombings highlighted on videos can bring strategic results by themselves alone. And we often do not understand our own goals for waging war, let alone the goals and desires of the people we're killing, but rarely see. This is what I think is a major disconnect, is that we do not understand it, often at the policy level especially, the basics of war, such that it's a clash of wills and that violence is being used to bend an enemy to our will. Nick will recognize this as a quote from Clausewitz, as a professor at the Naval War College would. But But I remember myself a personal experience. After a late night meeting in the White House Situation Room, I was back in the old executive office building with a senior official, and we'd been meeting on a particular issue. And I was outside his door for about 15 minutes, and we were standing out there, and I was arguing a Clausewitzian view about this particular action that we were debating about. And I said that, we don't have the same will as our opponent did. For our opponent, this is life and death. For us, this is something optional. And I said, we're bound to lose if that continues, unless we're as invested in this action as our opponent is. Is that it's sometimes hard for policymakers to understand. We sometimes forget to understand that passions that war can elicit from a population, as Clausewitz clearly identified in his book, Vom Krieg, when he described war as a combination of, yes, rational calculation, but also chance and primordial violence. And I say this irrespective of party or administration here when I make this critique. We do not seem to understand at times that war is one of man's most brutal, but also unpredictable endeavors. And that fact should always, I think, be presented up front to the American people so they understand what we're getting ourselves into.
So as we think about the challenges moving forward, are there, in this broad sweep of non-traditional warfare, are there irregular warfare capabilities? Are there institutional skills that you are concerned the United States may be losing as we enter the midpoint of this century? That things we could do during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period that perhaps we're not able to do so well anymore, that may prove to be quite critical for achieving U.S. national security aims in the future.
Well, here's my view of what we need to be prepared for. And this will not make anyone happy, but the answer is everything. But I think it's the reality, because whatever conflict one thinks is coming, it's almost never that conflict that the nation faces. The U.S. Armed Forces, but the entire national security administration needs to be capable of handling a wide range of issues, from counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, yes, those two hated words now, to conventional warfare against a peer on the sea, land, air, space, cyberspace. We also have to be ready for the economic challenges that come with these wars, especially the high end in conventional warfare. There's a saying in the military: you train for certainty, you educate for uncertainty. That's what we need to do, both for the uniformed military and for our national security establishment. Yes, I've spent a career in irregular warfare. We must not lose those lessons learned, although we are doing so. We've closed, the Marine Corps and the Army especially have closed those centers that studied and cataloged the lessons learned of counterinsurgency, cultural operations, those sorts of issues, to concentrate on major peer wars. A defense budget with almost $1 trillion or more than $1 trillion now should be able to do both. I remember, as a Marine reservist, I was the assistant operations officer of a Marine regiment. I spent a summer in the desert at 29 Palms practicing combined arms exercises for that reserve regiment, conventional war, fire support coordination. 2 years later, that reserve regiment was mobilized and in Afghanistan doing counterinsurgency. Or, excuse me, I think it was Iraq. I wasn't with it at the time. But it just showed they had to be able to do both. The same with our national security establishment. We need to train, yes, for certainty, but we need to educate our leaders to be able to handle both the conventional warfare challenges and the irregular warfare challenges and the political warfare challenges that our country faces. We face them all. We have to be ready for them all. We don't have a choice. So, yes, the answer is everything. We have to be ready for everything. It can be done. You will not be, obviously, you will have certain elements or certain people who are experts more on one side than the other. But I know from my own experiences, both as a Marine and as an agency paramilitary officer, there's no reason why the average person should not be flexible enough to be able to have one set of tools for one area, but also another set of tools for another. and to use those tools as necessary and to recognize where one is needed and where the other is needed.
And to close, I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask a question because we've been asking you questions. What do you think policymakers should be asking today that they aren't paying enough attention to?
I do have a simple suggestion, then an observation, based on my own personal experiences. Our nation's been at war for too long, and it needs a long period of peace to rebuild its military and to heal our own internal wounds caused by some of these wars and our domestic differences. Hopefully, we can maintain a strong military so that deterrence can provide us with a sustained period of peace for us to do this. And that is what I wish, and that is what I would suggest to close up this interview. And thank you for having me on your podcast.
Well, thank you for joining us. This has been a very wide-ranging and deep conversation that I think our listeners will appreciate.
This has been an episode of Shifting Ground, a podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs. For more information about the articles mentioned in this episode, please visit us at orbisjournal.org. Until next time.